Okay, so we continue our study through the book of Matthew, and we're in the 27th chapter. Looking at the time that Jesus is on trial for the first time before Pilate. We talked about the trials of Jesus. He's already stood before Annas, then Caiaphas, and now before Pilate. Pilate is not really interested in this. Pilate doesn't really want to be involved in this. It's a headache that he doesn't want to have to deal with these Jews and their laws. And he's, as we'll go through all of this, see that he really is convinced that Jesus is innocent, but he just does not have the nerve, it seems like, to stand up to the Jews. And when they threaten him with possibilities of being reported to Caesar, he kind of backs away and doesn't do what needs to be done. But as we look at this tonight, Pilate has questioned Jesus about some things. This question especially. He says to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, that's what many were saying. That's one of the accusations that the Jews had made against him, that this man claims to be a king. And they're going to, deny they have anything to do with him, recognize him as king. They only recognize, they say, Caesar is king. And we'll talk more about that too as we get along about that. So that's the question he brings to him. Are you the king of the Jews? And we mentioned this last week. The word "you" there is emphatic in the Greek. And by that I mean it's just emphasis has been put on that. The verbs in the Greek language, if it's singular, first person singular, second person singular, third person singular, you can know by that who's being spoken to. And so here, the word that's used there has the word in it, within it itself, the subject, you. But then the word "you" in the Greek, "su," is added to it. So are you, the king of the Jews? That's a way of emphasizing it. And the idea seems to be here is that when he says that, he's in essence saying, are you one who appears here so humble? Are you the Jews' king? Are you the one? And he would say that because at this time Jesus doesn't look like a king. There's nothing about him that you would see. He's there and he's dressed in peasant's garments. I mean, he's not a rich man. Does not have all of that flashy clothing and everything. So in that sense, he doesn't appear to be a king. He doesn't have a crown. He doesn't have a scepter to show that he rules, anything of that nature. But rather he's bound. He's been brought bound to Pilate. So Pilate, doesn't see him as being a king. And so at this time, initially, he's more amused at Jesus being put before him as a king than feeling any threats or dangers in that. And so he raises this question, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus responded to that with the affirmative. Jesus says, it is as you have said. He acknowledges the fact that he is king. Mark chapter 15 and verse 2, when he asked him this question, are you the king of the Jews? He answered and says to him, it is as you say. So Christ acknowledges the fact that he is a king. Now, that in itself initially, I would think would be something disturbing to Pilate. That here's this man brought before him as the king of the Jews, and he's acknowledging the fact that he is a king. But Jesus is a king in a different way. And when you look into John's account of this, Jesus asks a question then of Pilate in regard to this. He says, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? So Jesus wants to know where Pilate's coming from when he asks the question, are you a king? He wants to know, in what sense are you speaking to me as king? Do you think that I'm king in a political sense? Because if that's the case, then the answer is no, he's not a king. But if you're asking, is Jesus a king in the religious sense? Then to that Jesus would respond, yes, that's correct, because he is a king. He is meant to be a king. He's never denied being king in that sense, that he is a king that's been sent a king over God's kingdom. But Pilate needs to understand that. He needs to understand what type of king Jesus is. He's not a political king. And because of that, he's not a threat in that respect to Rome. He's not someone who's going to be getting up an army to try to overthrow Rome, nor is he going to get up an army to defend himself against the Jews who are opposed to him and stir up trouble there that would cause Rome to be concerned about that and actions that they might take against him. He is not a political king. Then John in 18:35, we see the response here of Pilate to Jesus' statement, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Or that. Jesus, or he says to Jesus, "What have you done?" Pilate is kind of perplexed as to why the Jews have brought him there. I mean, he's heard their complaints against him, but there are things that are obviously not true we talked about last week. So Pilate is becoming testy over this whole thing. It's bothering him. And he says to Jesus, "What have you done?" He wants some reason as to why Jesus has been brought to him, some reason why he is here on trial before him and what he needs to do in response to it. So he's questioning Jesus. "What have you done in regard to this?" And so Jesus is going to respond to him and let him know what kind of a king he is. John 18:36, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." So what's he telling Pilate when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world"? Yeah, his is a spiritual kingdom. It's not a physical kingdom. It's not of this world. It's not like the kingdom that Rome has, a physical kingdom. His is a spiritual kingdom. And that's in keeping with everything that had been said in the prophecies about Christ and about the kingdom that he was going to establish. It is a spiritual kingdom. I'd like to look at the book of Isaiah chapter 2 in regard to this, the prophecies that Isaiah made about it. If you'll turn there to Isaiah 2, and if someone will read verses 2 through 4 for us. That's 3 verses, but it's not really that short. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. All right, please.
It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains. It shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes with many people. And they shall beat their swords in their plowshares, and their spears in their pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore."
Okay. There's 4 different things that he says there about the kingdom that he's going to establish. But the latter are about these things that's going to pass with Christ. But the last part there in verse 4, when he talks about it, there he's talking about the nature of the kingdom that's going to be established. And if you'll see from that, it's obvious it's not a physical kingdom that he's talking about, like Rome has or anything of that nature, because he says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. So in Christ's kingdom, those weapons, those physical weapons of war that a physical kingdom are going to be used, are described here as being changed, as being beaten into what? Instruments of agriculture. Things that will be used not to fight battles, but to provide for people. And so it's not a physical kingdom like Rome. It's a spiritual kingdom. And so Christ tells Pilate here, "My kingdom is not of this world." If it were a worldly kingdom, then he said, "My servants would fight." But Jesus has forbidden that. When Peter drew the sword to cut off the ear of Malchus, servant of the high priest, what did Jesus tell him to do? Yep. Put up your sword. Put it in its place. That's not the kind of kingdom he has. It's not going to be a kingdom that's going to be established by physical force and ruled by physical force. It's a spiritual kingdom that he has. And so Jesus talks about his kingdom that he has. Now, if Jesus says he has a kingdom, what do you think? What does that imply about Jesus? He must be a king. And so that's Pilate's next question to him then. He says, "So you are a king?" Well, yes, he is. And like I said, Jesus has never denied that. But he just wants Pilate to understand He's not a kingdom of this world. His kingdom's not of this world. He's not a physical king in that sense. He is a king that rules over a spiritual kingdom. And that's what he's concerned about. That's what he's wanting to do. And so, yes, he is a king, but he's not a king like maybe Pilate and others are thinking, and certainly not something that would cause the people to be fearful of Christ. So he's not that type of king. Those people, Jesus says, who will hear my voice and will follow me, those people who are of the truth, those are the people of my kingdom. And then this is where we've talked about before, this question, as it were, that comes forth from Pilate to Jesus. He asked that question, what is truth? Now, when Pilate asked that question, I don't think he's concerned with a philosophical question that's been going on for years prior to this time, where people have been questioning, what is truth? You know, Pilate, it seemed to asking this question to show his total really indifference to it. You know, what is truth? You know, there are different ideas that people have about truth. For instance, if I were to say this wood right here, it's smooth. That's smooth wood. Is it? You know, if you put it under an electron microscope, you're going to see crevices and deep crevices in it and so forth. You say, well, that's not really smooth, is it? Well, what do you mean by smooth? Is it what appears to be smooth, what feels to be smooth, or is it what you can see through magnification? You know, and so Pilate was that type of, what is truth? You know, that's something that can be debated. Anything you want to talk about, people can debate whether or not that's true or not. What's the truth and what isn't? So he's not really concerned about the truth. He doesn't have it. But Jesus is concerned about the truth. And every one of us needs to be concerned about the truth. Pilate could care less about the Jewish religion. He could care less about their law and what they say this is truth and this is what men ought to do. This is how men ought to behave. He doesn't care about that. And I think that he's really upset by the fact that he's been put in this position where he's having to deal with these people, and it's really a matter of their law. And so what Pilate really wants to do is to be able to get out of that situation. Some way to end this just by dismissing Jesus and letting him go. And he had every opportunity to do that. You know, he had the power. He could have simply said, you know, there's absolutely nothing in the charges you've made against Jesus, and so I'm going to set him free. But he wouldn't do that because, you know, we talked about his character. Things have been pointed out through historians about this man. He could stand for what he believed was right unless it was going to cause him troubles. So when these people say that, you know, if you let this man go, Jesus claims to be a king. If you let him go, you're not being a friend of Caesar. And that worried Pilate. Because, you know, if word gets back to Rome, to Caesar, that Pilate is allowing this man to go around claiming to be a king, then that's going to be evidence you're not really the friend of Caesar, and you're going to be in trouble with Caesar. So Pilate just will not dismiss Jesus and let him go. But he's looking for some kind of way he can get out of this situation and avoid all this and the problem that's bringing about him. And so he's trying different ways to get out of this situation. He points out that the Jews had a custom that at this time of year, at the Passover, that Pilate would release some prisoner to allow them to go free. And so he thinks maybe this is a way that he can avoid this problem, get out of this trouble altogether. And so really what he does, he puts forth two different people as a possibility for releasing. There's Barabbas and there's Jesus. And so he brings them out to the idea, all right, who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus? Now stop and think a minute about these two individuals. First of all, Barabbas. What do we know about him from the Bible? He's an insurrectionist. And so what does that mean, Steve? What's an insurrectionist? A person causing trouble, and he's opposed to the government. and he's trying to overcome their control over him. And so, now that's something that would really, catch the attention of Rome. That's something they will not put up with, someone who's going to be a troublemaker like this. He's an insurrectionist. What else do we know about him? He's a murderer. I think Mark's one that describes him as being a robber, and then also points out here in John that he is a murderer. Notorious? Yeah. So he's somebody that's well known for the kind of individual he is. And so these aren't just vague ideas being thrown out about this man. This is something he's known for. And so that's what we know about him. But what about Jesus? Well, we know, and Pilate knows, that the charges being made against him are false. He's not that kind of a person. Yes, he acknowledges that he's a king, but he's not a king like Caesar. He's a king over a spiritual kingdom. So he's different from that. So in Pilate's mind, he's thinking that's nothing. That's nothing to worry about. So who would you like to have dismissed, and maybe they're going to take up residence next to you? You want this person living next to you who's an insurrectionist, a robber, and a murderer? Or would you want Jesus living next to you, a man who claims to be king? So in Pilate's mind, who would you think the people would want to be released? Jesus. And so Pilate's probably thinking, whoa, this is my way out of this. They have a custom that I do this, and I'll give it up to them, who they want to be dismissed. And surely they're going to say, let's dismiss Jesus. And so that takes care of the problem. All right, I set him free because he is innocent after all. He needs to be set free. I'm just not strong enough to insist upon that because I don't want to oppose these Jews who are angry with me and threatening me before Caesar. But if the Jews themselves say set Jesus free, then that takes care of the problem. But Pilate hasn't reckoned with the meanness of these people who are opposed to Jesus. And he does not know that these leaders of the Jews have already encouraged the people to ask for the release of Barabbas, to let him be the one to go free. And so, that's something that Pilate hasn't been counting on. But that's the very thing that these people do. When asked by Pilate who they would have to be set free, the people ask for Barabbas to be set free. By the way, what does that name Barabbas mean? Son of what? Oh. All right, what's Abba? Abba, Father. Son of the Father. Some people have speculated, don't know anything about this being true, but speculated, did this mother, when that child was born, hope that this might be the Messiah? That this might be the one to deliver him, so she names him Son of the Father? Well, Jesus is the Son of the Father. He's the only begotten of God, and he is the Messiah. But they choose to let Barabbas be set free. So then Pilate wants to know, well, what am I going to do with Jesus, your king? And what's their response? Yeah, crucify him. They demand that. Let Barabbas go free, but this man Jesus, put him to death. Have him crucified. That's what they're wanting for them. And so Pilate is stuck again with that problem. Can't seem to get rid of it. But something else happens that gives Pilate the idea that maybe he can get rid of this problem and not have to make a decision to have Jesus put to death. And that is the case that regards Herod. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod. Why did he do that? What caused him to send Jesus to Herod? All right, because Jesus is a Galilean. Now, that's what he's heard. Jesus spent a lot of his ministry up in the northern part of the country, up in Galilee, up in Capernaum. That's where he worked from. And so he hears Pilate say, oh, is he a Galilean? Well, who's Herod? Yeah, he's the king of that area, of Galilee and Perea. And so he thought, oh, Jesus is a Galilean? And guess what? Herod just happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. And so Pilate thinks, all right, here's the solution to it. Jesus is a Galilean. That's Herod's territory. He's the king of that. And so he sends Jesus to Herod. And not only that, listen, Herod and Pilate have not gotten along well at all. But the Bible tells us that Herod had long wished to see Jesus. Why? Yeah, he wanted to see some miracle being done by Jesus. He's heard about him, evidently, the power that he has, the miracles he's done. And boy, you know, we hadn't had a magician this good in a long, long time. I'd like to see this man. And I'd like to see him do some miracle. And so he's happy to receive him. And Pilate's happy to get rid of him. And so he thinks now it becomes Herod's problem, and he'll have to decide what to do. So when Jesus goes to Herod, how does Jesus act in Herod's presence? He won't say anything to him. You know, and Herod is disappointed, you know, because he had wanted to meet this man. He's heard about him, and he wanted to see him do some miracle, and Jesus comes, and he tries to talk to him, and Jesus doesn't answer anything. And so Herod becomes upset, and he pretty much just then turns Jesus over to be ridiculed by his own soldiers. And they're the ones, you know, that would put that purple robe on Jesus. And they were the ones that would mockingly bow before him and hail him as king, you know, making fun of him just as others had done. So they don't get anything out of that. But now, I wanted to do for Herod a little bit like we did with Pilate and talk about Herod and who he is. Herod, this Herod, now there are a number of Herods mentioned in the New Testament. This Herod is Herod Antipas. He was the son of Herod the Great. And when Herod the Great died, you know, he had his kingdom divided up among his sons. And Herod Antipas was not happy with what he was given, and he had challenged that. Challenged his will, as it were. But Caesar ruled in favor of the will of Herod the Great, and so what Herod Antipas got was what he had been given by his father. So he's put in charge then of Galilee and Perea to be over it. But at that time, Galilee was also called Galilee of the Gentiles. And that's what Herod Antipas is. He's a Gentile. He is half Idumean and half Samaritan. So as the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia said of him, therefore he had not a drop of Jewish blood in his veins. And sometimes the Herods like to claim Jewish lineage. Herod the Great had done that. He had to have something made up where a well-known Jew had been his ancestor. But in reality, there's no blood, no Jewish blood in the veins of this man. The gospel picture of him is that, number one, he's superstitious. What do we know about Herod that suggests some idea of superstition in him? Believe what? Believed in ghosts? Yeah, because when John the Baptist was killed, put to death, and then Jesus comes along, what did he think about Jesus? He thought that was John the Baptist come to life again. You know, so that's what he believed about that. As to his character and the way how did Jesus describe Herod Antipas? Let's see if I put that verse down here. Turn over to Luke chapter 13. Luke chapter 13 and beginning at about verse 31 here. Right. Yeah, Jesus refers to him as a fox. What did I say? 13:31 maybe here. Okay. Read verse 31 and 32 together there. They were warning Jesus about Herod. This is Herod Antipas, and he's threatening to kill you. He's looking to kill you. And Jesus said, you go tell that fox. Well, what did he mean by that? What do you think of? You think about a fox. Cunning. You know, I had friends of mine when I lived in Calera. There was a gentleman down there in the church. He did a lot of trapping. He was a truck driver, but 3 months out of the years he spent trapping. And, you know, that man was catching everything. I didn't realize we had some of that stuff, including mink in Alabama that he was trapping. But he said the hardest thing in the world to trap is a fox. He said, you know, he might catch one sometime and been killed by a car. He'd get one like that. But he said, you know, trying to trap them was hard. They're very cunning. You know, hard to trick them in any way like that. Well, Jesus says that about this man, Herod Antipas. He's cunning like a fox. As far as morality is concerned, what do we know about him? No, about Herod Antipas. All right, he took his brother Philip's wife. And, you know, didn't think anything about that. But then John the Baptist came along. And John the Baptist condemned him for what he has done. That he was living in outright disobedience to God's law. He had no right to be married to Philip's wife. But he took her. And because John the Baptist criticized him for that, eventually what happens is that Herod has John put to death. And so even though the Bible talks about how that he liked John, and he was also fearful of John because the people held him to be a prophet, yet still because of John's criticizing of him and, you know, prophecies that he makes, he eventually has John the Baptist put to death. So morally speaking, he's not a good man, anyone of that sense here at all. But he's the one who's become the king, and he's the one to whom Jesus is sent in hopes that that'll rid the problem for Pilate, and Pilate won't have to worry about that anymore. But Herod questions Jesus. He doesn't get any response from that. And so, you know, he wants to get rid of him. Get back where I was at here. So Herod let his men join the Jews in mocking Jesus and doing this. He's the one that puts the purple robe on him. He's the one that they put the scepter of reed into his hand and bow before him and holler, saying to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And then, when that's through, he sends Jesus back where? Back to Pilate. So now, really, you know, you've got the trial of Jesus before Annas, then before Caiaphas, then before Pilate, then before Herod, and now back again before Pilate for the second time. And so Pilate still has this problem here. He's convinced Jesus is innocent. He ought to be set free, but he's afraid to do that because the Jews are so set on Jesus being put to death, and they have, in essence, kind of threatened him that if he doesn't put Jesus to death, then you're not a friend of Caesar because this man's claiming to be king. And that's the type of thing that would bring down the wrath of the king of the nation of Rome, the Caesar, against him for doing that. And so disappointed, you know, in this, you know, Pilate seeks out one more opportunity maybe to release Jesus. But it will not be without punishment being inflicted. And so what he's going to do, he tells them, I will chastise him, and then I will set him free. And by chastising, what he was talking about was scourging Jesus. And when you think about the scourging, the practices of it, as it was done by the Romans, it was a cruel, vicious punishment that was given out to people. William Barclay said that it was sometimes referred to as the Roman half-death. You had a centurion who's in charge of the scourgings, and he is there primarily to see to it that the man is beaten as much as possible but to stop before killing him. Some people did die from scourging. But most time it just inflict as much punishment as you can, but stop before you kill him. Barclay also said there were many people who went mad from this beating, that it was so intense and so painful that it literally drove people insane in suffering all of that goes on. Reading some of the things about it, the only ones who were exempted from scourging were women, Roman senators, and soldiers, except in cases of desertion. And then even the Roman soldiers could be scourged. Normally there were between 1 and 6 trained Roman officers called lictors who were responsible for dispensing the blows to the victims. The victors chosen to administer the scourging had previously received special medical training so that they knew how to wield the whip so as to open bruises which had already formed. The instrument used for scourging was a short whip called a flagrum or flagellum. Picture of what some of these used. Usually they would use lead balls tied into the ends of it, or sometimes bits of bone that would be used to tear. Now the lead on it, when they're struck with that, would bruise the body. But after a series of blows on that, it will open up. It will tear the skin and cause it to bleed. And so that it says in essence that what happened with this was the person that's to be scourged is stripped of his clothing, and his hands are tied to a post. Now, if you've seen the movie, The Passion of Christ, you remember some of these scenes that he's tied to that so that he can't move, and then he's beaten with it. The Roman soldiers would repeatedly strike the victim's back, buttocks, and legs with their full force, causing deep contusions, lacerations from repeated blows, cut into the underlying muscles, and rip the overlaying skin of the back to a point where it hangs in ribbons of bleeding flesh. The capillaries and veins were often torn, causing intense bleeding, and at times leaving the entrails exposed. Even one time that the victim fainted, if the lictors could feel a pulse and detect sufficient respiration, the beating would continue. Once the centurion in charge determined that the prisoner is near death, the beating is halted. So, the Jewish people practice beating people. But the beatings that were administered by Jewish law were limited to what? 40 lashes. Now, the Pharisees, who were so strict in the keeping of the law and not wanting to violate it in any way, would have someone count the blows, and when it got to the number 39, they stopped. They didn't want, they were afraid, maybe we miscounted. And maybe that next 40th blow is really going to be 41, and we'd be in violation of it. So we would stop at 39. So it's limited what they would do. There's no such limitation to the Romans except whenever that centurion felt like he's near to dying, that if we continue it, he will die as a result. So they'd stop it at that point. And that's what's happened here with Jesus. You know, he's beaten with this at this time. And like I said, according to Jewish law, couldn't receive more than 40 lashes. So Jesus is beaten. And I don't know, I never thought anything about it. I never studied about scourging, what it's like under the Romans, what they did. And sometimes when you'd see the movies, the person might still have on, that's portraying Jesus, might have still on the garment, and you see in the back of that being shredded a little. But then when you see that movie, The Passion, and the way they portray that, because it wasn't just across the back, but it said the back, the buttocks, and the legs. And so this is the third time, because of this beating, that Pilate hopes that will be sufficient to cause the Jews to finally give up and say that's enough, and let the man go free. He brings Jesus out after the scourging, and he says to the people, "Behold the man." Now, I thought I had that picture here. All right, yeah. again, this is from the movie The Passion, when he's brought out, and you see something about it, being beaten like that. And some people expected when he said to the people, "Behold the man," that he may have been appealing to the people's pity. Here's a man, you've cried out for his death, you wanted him to, but now look how he has been beaten. He's at the point of death now, as it were, from this. And maybe play upon their sympathy. Would this not be sufficient? Are you not satisfied, your bloodlust for this man? Is it not satisfied enough now that you could simply let him go? That's possible. But we don't know how Pilate said it. There's also the possibility that when Pilate said, "Behold the man," he may have said that in awe. It's true this man doesn't look like a king, and especially in a situation like this, being beaten the way he was. But he may have said it in such a way to suggest to the people, he may not look like a king, but he has all the bearings of a king. Now, I don't know how true this is, but William Barclay said that the word that's used here for man, the Greek word, normal word that's used here is the word anthropos. It was a common word for man or for mankind. But Barclay said just a few years later, that same word among the Greeks became known as the ideal man, the perfect man. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know what evidence he has of that. But I do know this. When you're talking about Jesus, behold the man, you're talking about the ideal man. You're talking about the perfect man. The man who lived this life here just like you and I have to live it, facing all the same temptations that all men have to face in life, and yet he never once violated the will of God. He doesn't have any mistakes. There's nothing you can point to and say, here's where he goofed up, here's where he erred, here's where he sinned against God. You just can't find it. He's the perfect man. And so maybe Pilate is suggesting here to these people, who he really is. He's not just an innocent person, but he's special about it. Here is the ideal man that's there. And so maybe Pilate's hoping in this respect that would cause the people to be satisfied and they would relent and allow Jesus to go free, and Pilate would be free of the problem. He could let this man go without having to kill him, without having him put to death. And so that's what I say, this is the third time that he's tried to have Jesus put to death. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this idea about Jesus when he says, behold the man. That you and I need to continually behold the man. We need to continually be looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Looking has a great deal to do with how we live and how we behave ourselves in this life. Depending upon what we're looking at. And so we've got to be concerned about that. And there's so many examples that I could think of that I looked in the Bible and wrote down several of these verses about the influence for good or evil depending upon what you're looking at. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. What tempted Eve to eat that fruit that was forbidden? God had said, you can eat of any fruit of the tree of the garden, but of this tree, you're not to eat of it. And the day you eat of it, you'll die. Well, why did she eat of it? Because she was looking at it. She saw it was desirable for food. It looked good. And it was something that could make you wise. And so just looking at it is what led her to sin against God. What are we looking at? Are we looking at the temptations around us, and thinking about those things that maybe tempt us? And if you keep your eye on it, you keep thinking about that and looking at it, sooner or later you're going to give in to it. And you're going to commit that sin with that. Genesis 13:10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. This is a time when there is dispute that has arisen between Abraham and Lot, between Abraham's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen. And Abraham has pled with Lot, we don't need to do this because we're kinsmen. And so he makes a suggestion. We need to divide. And Lot, I'm giving you an opportunity. You choose the land you want. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. But if you choose the right, I'll go to the left. And so Lot raises his eyes and he looks. The text said here, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. And so Lot chose that land. What was the problem with the choice he made? The sinful cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, before they were destroyed, but that's the land he chose. And as a result, he's going to lose his wife. His own daughters are going to commit incest with him. All of these problems are going to come about him, and his wife is going to die as a result because of where he's looking. You'll see that again in Genesis 19:26, as they're fleeing from the destruction, and God had told them not to look behind you. But his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Where are you looking? She's looking where God had told them not to look. And so many times, depending upon where we look, is going to determine what's going to happen to us. In the New Testament, Matthew 14:30, we talked about this event earlier as we studied through Matthew. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, saying, Lord, save me. This is where Jesus has come walking on the water, and they think it's a ghost, and they cry out, and Jesus says, be not afraid, it's I. So Peter said, Lord, if it's you, bid me come to you on the water. And he says, come, and Peter gets out, and he's walking on the water and doing well until what? Stopped looking at Jesus, started looking at the winds, saw they were boisterous. That's when he became afraid, and that's when he began to sink. It's important where we look. Looking can also have a positive influence. And we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next week. Our time's gone. But just think about that. Behold the man. If we can keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and keep him as the apple of our eye, then it'll make all the difference in the world in how we live and how we are able to serve God in this life. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, again, we're so grateful and thankful to Thee for the love You have for us. And we're grateful, Father, for Your loving us so much that You've given Your Son to die for us, that You've given to us Your holy word, that we can read and study and find strength and encouragement and help therein to be stronger in our spirit. And we pray, Father, You'd help us to do just that. Help us to keep our eyes focused upon Thee and upon Jesus. And help us, Father, to live to please Thee. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.